All right, I hope my dog doesn't bark.
It will.
I'm going to put this on the recording. I hope my dog doesn't bark because I don't know if you can see that over the screen, but that's in my backyard is a very large bear at the moment. And so she was barking her head off and I just brought her in. Hopefully it works out.
Okay.
I had to go out and warn the workmen. Welcome, everybody. Making my own martinis today, Olga. Have a drink?
Up to my end. Hang on. What happened to the intro music?
We got rid of that.
Oh,
Nobody liked it but me.
I liked it.
Welcome, everybody, to Martinis with Scott, a show about winning momentum in life and in business. Special guest today, Olga Jilani from Sinclair Range for another hour. Then she's leaving the firm. So this is the wrap-up show, the goodbye to Olga, although I'm sure she's available for other Martinis with Scotts in the future. That true, Olga?
That's correct.
Welcome to the show. Cheers.
Здоровья.
Spasiba.
Good.
That is correct, right?
Yep. That's very much.
All right. Where are my notes for you here?
I have
So, Olga, you've been with Sinclair Range or its predecessor firms for 9-10 years.
7.
How long? 7?
7.5.
7 years. Okay. Just feels longer to me, obviously, I guess.
Yep.
And you came out of an investment bank in Toronto.
Yep.
And you joined, I think what at the time was called Range Corporate Advisors. And it's been sort of the Sinclair Range journey that you've been through a large part of that, where we as a firm have been advisors to entrepreneurial high growth companies. And also through that period, we built our brand is really the #1 brand in the country for mid-market and smaller turnaround, corporate restructuring, done insolvency work, but actually turnaround work. And you've been a large part of that. You were there. If people are looking up Sinclair Range at sinclairrange.com, we own as a portfolio company Roofers World in Ottawa, and you've been there for a large part of the Roofers World trials and tribulations, and now the turnaround journey, which is going fantastic. We did Beresford Box. You were there from beginning to end, I think, on Beresford Box, correct?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. One of our big portfolio holdings. Novani Stainless, which we closed on in June. Obviously, you've been a big part of that. And you were there for the beginning of Martinis with Scott.
From the second episode, because Ashley did the first.
Well, that was, we called that episode 0.
Okay, you're right.
We went to the National Club to see if Periscope actually worked and whether the recording device, whatever it was at the time, actually worked. And the answer was not really.
Yep.
As I recall.
And almost no one told you it wouldn't work, right?
I think everyone told me that. I entirely blame Scott Adams, who, with his thousands and thousands and thousands of followers, on tens of thousands on Periscope, which is a live platform, he's testing YouTube Live as we speak. Yesterday, he did one on YouTube Live. I think he's finally giving up with that technology. So anyways, you've been there from the beginning of a lot of this. And so I just wanted, this is mostly just us having fun today and saying goodbye and talk about what you've learned. You came out of the financial analyst or associate side out of an investment bank on Bay Street, handling junior mining files. And then you moved into the murky corporate finance, private company, semi-operational job that we do, which is a different world. And so what are let's talk first about the change in the career and what's different, what you learned culturally, and the difference between the work. It's funny, I've been reviewing CVs all day for someone at an associate level at Sinclair Range, and it's just so clear that a lot of the applicants have no idea what the job is, and their CV is nowhere close to being appropriate. which I assume is their funnel strategy, just apply for everything under the sun. But anyways, I'm talking too much. What is, what was the transition like for you? Let's start there.
So I want to tell a story that I told at the last dinner that we all had together, and that was the interview that I had at Dundee, and it was it's in June. I used to know the date by heart, but it was June 2010, and there was a G8 protest in Toronto, and I had my second round of interviews for investment banking, and it was the 28th floor of Dundee Place, which is 1 Adelaide East, and I was interviewing with this guy with this. He was a director at the time. He was very, very sharp. He was fantastic throughout my whole career. He went on to Cantor Fitzgerald. He was a CFO. Like, he had a great career after Dundee. But so he's grilling me on these accounting and these finance questions, and they take really good care of you, even if you're like in the interview process. So I had this ergonomic chair, and they gave me a glass of water, and I'm answering these questions, firing back and forth, and it's really rapid pace. And then I look down, and like my chair starts to shake, and the glass of water starts to shake. Like, I see the ripples in it, and I look at him, and there's like, he sees nothing. He's totally fine, because I'm losing it. Like, what is going on? Like, my body's shaking, the water, like I'm seeing things. So I made a very quick decision that I'm losing my mind, and I have to pretend like I'm not, which is exactly how I describe capital markets. You know that something's off, but you just got to keep going, and everything's fine.
Right. It's not an earthquake. You're all good.
Yeah. And that was actually the day that an earthquake hit Toronto, like, which is not, I expected maybe like the G8 protesters like did something downstairs, that like the whole building was shaking. Like, that was more probable than an earthquake hitting downtown Toronto, but that's exactly what happened. And actually, he didn't acknowledge it through the entire interview. So I literally took the elevator down, just kind of, I accepted that my mind had left. Like, I was gonna have to go see a therapist after this, but I just kind of like went on the date, and I actually found out like much later in the evening that there was an earthquake. Nobody was talking.
Odds are he was drunk though, right?
No, he was actually one of the more sober ones. So
okay.
And when I brought it up, he would just be like, "Oh, when we met, like the ground shook. I was that focused." But anyways, and that's how I describe capital markets. And strangely enough, the turnaround space is so much more sane and so much more focused on fundamentals rather than perception. Because ultimately, on the public side, there's almost an endless supply of cash as long as you're in the hot sector. And we saw that with cannabis, we saw that with mining, we're seeing that with mining now. It's the prospect of cash flow, whereas on the turnaround side, we were all about cash now, yesterday. And I think that once you become that much more frugal and much more oriented to managing cash flow, that you truly understand the business. And this goes back to, you and I have done so many martinis with Scott where we focus almost exclusively on building financial models, building cash flows. It comes down to when you're doing the modeling work in capital markets, you're focused exclusively on coming up with a share value. Whereas when we do it, it's focused on cash needs, which seem like they should reconcile, but they never do. Because there's multiples, there's discount values where we focus almost entirely on how do I generate cash? And if I'm having a shortfall, what is that shortfall so that I can pre-plan for it? Whereas in the capital market side, that's just kind of like a footnote. And I think the focus is so different. Valuation based on projection versus operating a business and being able to make payroll. Those are completely different objectives. And then it seems like there should be some overlap, but there isn't.
I think in the capital market side, if I could take a crack at this, it's more about sales. It's not even, the valuation is not really about value. It's about what can I sell?
Yeah.
Right. And what will the institutions, what will the retail market buy for? When you look at, you referenced cannabis, when you do deep dives into research reports, for example, on cannabis a year ago, not so much today, but if you look a year ago, and they're trying to value 2024 projected EBITDA times like 26.
Yeah.
Right? It's just something that mathematically doesn't make, and then they don't discount it at any reasonable rate back. Their discount rate back is like 10% or 8%, notwithstanding their multiple being 26, which mathematically is the inverse of the discount rate. And so there's just this huge disconnect there. Right, that's not about value. No valuator, of which I am one, is going to come up with that number. That's about creating a metric that people will buy and sell at. It's a market-based pricing as opposed to valuation in my personal view. Whereas everything that we do in corporate finance, which would be not just turnarounds, but how do we finance and senior or venture finance growing companies, companies in high growth? And we have done some cannabis, we've done some energy deals. You could remind me of other ones. We've done some tech deals, but things that are growing rapidly. You need a much harder look at in the private sector at what's real and substantive in terms of value. That would be my view on it.
But what's interesting is that you have a quick shot on valuations from several months ago where it always comes down to cash flow generation. And I remember when I was in university, how to value a mine was like this matrix that you had to understand. And then I had a managing director at Dundee who said that you value a mine the exact same way you value a building. It's just that you blow the building up at a certain point in time that you've decided on, no longer exists. It's a finite resource.
Right.
So, which is, just rent collection is effectively what it is, net of your expenses. And that's the value for everything. And that's fundamentally true, which comes back to the work we do is based on fundamental cash flow generation. The work you do in capital markets is what kind of price tag can I stick on it based on precedent transactions. I remember at one time when I was at Dundee, the company prior to me joining had sold a mine for $150 million from two very large players. And maybe 3 or 4 months after, BMO put out a research report that valued that same mine at $3 billion. And they had no new drilling results, like nothing. They just came up with a new metric. Like it really did jump around like that. Like these are just real work. You can't make this stuff up. It's stranger than fiction. But I think that the biggest difference is fundamental valuation and cash flow generation rather than what can I sell it for. But that kind of, having your feet firmly on the ground translates into other aspects, like a culture that is sustainable, for example. We talk a lot about management techniques and how to persuade people to get on board. And whereas I don't think there's any skill set that's developed at a junior level anyways in capital markets in that regard.
Well, no, because we necessarily in our business dive much more into operations. Yep. And our business was purely advisory when you first started, and now we have as little advisory as possible right now. And we act as a private investment company, acquiring troubled businesses. So that's clearly more operational. But even as an, excuse me, sorry about that, choking on my martini. Even as an advisor, we got hands-on into operation, because if you're working with a troubled company or if you're working with a high growth company, it's really the same stuff. If you're trying to raise capital, you absolutely need to convince, excuse me, the market that there's a business plan there and that it will be executed on. And particularly on the troubled side, if it's the same management team, you need to answer the question, why now? What's going to change, right? What are you doing differently that's going to make this deal work at this particular point in time?
Yeah. Yep. It's a lot more a longer term outlook. And I remember when I first went to Roofers World, I think it was like one of my first assignments, and I actually went to Ottawa and I lived there. Your first advice was everything goes a lot slower. So you just need to be aware of it. And you have to be nice to these people because you need them to stick around. They have some sort of knowledge to pass on. I remember that very clearly because I thought, like, I'm always nice to everybody, but that was, my definition of nice anyway. Wow,
that's, I first moved to Ottawa in 94. Well, that's not true because I went to school there, but I started Merchant Capital in 1994 and I had moved from Toronto. And it took me about 6 months, which I guess is not that long, but it took me about 6 months to realize that I'm not being perceived well, right? Like I'm just being too aggressive, too blunt, which is me. But that's where you and I grew up, right? That's the street that we grew up on. It's the way that you talk, but it's not the way the rest of the world talks, and they find it offensive. So there's definitely a part of that.
I like how you just skipped over the offensive part. Yeah, no, they're deeply offended. I agree with you. Yeah, they find it offensive and
intimidating.
Kind of like tone deaf.
Yeah, intimidating. But the other thing is that I've always believed, and as I've become more experienced and more into the psychology of this, I've just proven myself correct. But I've always believed that you affect change, which at the end of the day is what we need to do. We need to change these companies. That you do that by focusing on the positive, right? Berating them and focusing on the negatives just isn't going to help.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it.
Yeah. When I put together kind of the bullet points on what to discuss, at the same time, I think what we both learned over maybe the last 2 years is that you can't be afraid to call people out when they stand in the way of your goals or you achieving your plan. Because even though you kind of have verbal buy-in, there are always individuals in every one of these companies, and usually at a higher management level, who are that stick in the mud, and maybe that's just a function of being exhausted, that they interfere with you being able to carry out your plan. And strangely enough, as much as you value their intelligence, their knowledge of the company, their strategy is just not, it's not in line with your overall plan, which is different than with the world they lived in for so long and frankly struggled in. But because that's all they know, they just can't even fathom that things can be different.
Well, I think it boils down to confirmation bias and insecurity, right? So you've got Robin in Ottawa, who used to run that company forever, and you could just mathematically look at Rufus World and say, this is a failure. This is a failure. I mean, it's been going on for a decade before we made changes, and objectively speaking, looking at KPIs, things aren't going very well, right? The fill rates are down, the revenue's down, they're losing money, they just need cash all the time, they're never hitting big targets on the sales side. They don't even know what sell-through means, never mind work to create better sell-through at their client base. They sell, if you're listening on the podcast, Rufus World sells to, Home Depot, the Ronas of the world. And you've got a guy who was around for the founding of the company for decades, and he's taking on a salary of whatever, 200 grand a year, somewhere in that range, sound about right? Yep. And he wants to convince you as an advisor or as a lender or as a new shareholder, as a partner, whatever, as a boss, he wants to convince you that he's good, that he's worth the 200,000, notwithstanding the evidence to the contrary. So every time you come up with another idea, say, hey, this isn't working, we should be doing this. That isn't working, we should be doing this. What goes through that fellow's head is an element of confirmation bias, which is, I can't be bad. Like, I know I'm good. I'm being paid all this money. I'm the founder of this company. Therefore, I can't be wrong. And if that's how you view everything, which is that it wasn't you, it was the other people, and that you're a victim, then it doesn't matter what the topic is. They could never, ever, ever, ever allow themselves to admit that they're part of the problem. They can't allow themselves to change because that just creates cognitive dissonance, right? It just creates this stress within them, and then it all just starts to fall apart. That's my theory. I operate on that.
Yeah, which when you really look at it, it's such a massive disadvantage to say, I mean, victimhood, obviously, but what it really stems from is lack of humility. If you were, so people will regularly, if you were to say that Scott Sinclair is a humble guy in Bay Street, you'd get laughed out of Hives, Harbor 60, Highs Calgary,
I'm rarely accused of that.
Yeah. No, there's plenty. There's many dining institution where you'll be asked to leave for your nonsense. But I think that what we do very well at Sinclair Range is regularly ask ourselves, are we screwing up? Or are we doing something wrong? And that is the key to success, that to ultimately, it's not self-doubt, there's a distinction there. But it's important to assess of like, well, is my strategy wrong? Is this person right? And it's that really is humility. And ultimately, if you start taking, if you step away from victimhood and you start taking responsibility for at least certain things that are going wrong in your business, and you say, that's my fault, what you're really saying is I can fix it.
Yeah.
But if you're trying
I would argue that I think the firm have a huge amount of self-doubt, a huge amount in the work that we do, which is not the same as a lack of confidence. It's just that this is not a science, it's creative. You would agree with that, I think. Okay. Right? If you're at when you were back at the investment bank and capital markets, that was a formula to a large extent. Sure. Right? And this is not a formula. We use some of the same tools, but it's really creative. Every situation is different. I describe it like Harlequin romances. When I was a kid, you're probably too young for that, but it's like,
ask your parents. Go on.
They put out 1,000 books, but there was only six storylines, and the settings changed and the characters changed, and turnarounds are a lot like that. They're not all the same, but there's only 6 or 10 storylines, and then they're all the same, and then it's just the circumstances and the settings and all that. But the solutions don't work because there's counterparties. Like, the characters have to accept the solution. And so I wake up every morning, I'm working on a client file right now, and I have a huge amount of self-doubt on that. Am I doing the right thing? I have to reevaluate sort of every day, are we going forward? But I couple that with confidence that this isn't 100%. I was describing that file today as, when I took it on, it was like a 5% probability, and now it's 85% probability. But it's not 100. It's not 100. And there's really, frankly, nothing I could do that can change that. All I can do is make the best decisions that we can to help this client, given the current situation that they're in. So I think management teams and advisors to troubled companies need to think the same way. The evidence is you're failing.
Did you change strategy between going from 5% confidence to 85% confidence?
Not really.
Okay. So just I think you did.
That's another thing. When I start at 5%, I don't have a strategy. Like, I don't walk in day one and think, okay, I know everything. Here's what's going to happen. Like, the strategy comes to me through the models that you built. Right? I start to look at that. I start to think about it. And then one thing that I have gained from being older and experienced is I have a pretty good idea what the counterparty is going to be looking for. So in this case, they have a bank. I have a pretty good idea what this aggressive in the situation, I have a good idea what their hot buttons are going to be and what we can accomplish and not accomplish with them. I have a pretty good idea what the new lender will be looking for and what's going to work and what's not going to work. And if you just keep it super simple with a couple of key things that you need to find a solution, I'm experienced enough to know those things and come up with a plan relatively quickly, which I did in that case. And then, much like I run all my businesses in my life, is like, I'm not hung up on the plan. I don't really care. It's a direction. It's just a direction, right? And as circumstances change, you need to be flexible. And to be able to do that, you need to be able to think, maybe this is wrong, right? But it's not, I don't take that personally. It's not me that was wrong. I think I made a great decision based on what I knew at the time, but things change all the time in this business.
But despite the fact that it's an art, you brought up the Harlequin novels and that there were only 6 stories. Shakespeare actually had a saying that there's only 7 stories, right? And that,
right, exactly.
Character, you change the setting.
Maybe I should use the Shakespeare.
Maybe.
Rather than the Harlequin.
Yeah, I mean, the whole, I actually pulled it up. So it's overcoming the monster. And these are actually applicable to exactly turnaround stories. Overcoming the monster, competitor, bad industry, whatever else. Rags to riches, that comes up a lot. The quest. We have a few of those coming in about, unmanned aerial vehicles, like that kind of stuff,
Oh
like
my goodness.
sky
Yeah.
idea. Voyager and Return, that's a good one. Rebirth, that's come up a few times. Comedy and tragedy, which I actually think both are kind of connective threads through
Yeah.
the previous five. But there's always a similarity. And when we walked into Navani, I saw things that just struck out at me in terms of being parallels to Roofer's World. And we actually talked about that on a previous podcast as well, that for example, this is a sole supplier for this one element. There's no one else and there's no one better and nobody does it. And then you kind of look a little closer,
That is a
turns out
common
there's
thing.
10. That comes up a lot. I mean, there's always overarching themes.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. So I've been working on, through Martinis with Scott, a bunch of content, and I've been working with some branding people in the US to try and sort of do exactly what you just said, which is pull this together into packageable pieces of content that have a common theme. And I think there's a lot more. I've never really thought of it before, and I don't even know how to express it, but I think there's a lot more commonality in science to this than I give credit to. Because these people have asked me things like, well, how do you do a turnaround? Well, I've never really thought about that before. You just do it, right? And so I've been coming up with a formula for how to make more money, which is, bottom line is, attack your contribution margin first, right? Overhead second, and revenue last, right? And that's your whole income statement if you think about it that way. But I mean, what does every company do? Well, they just they don't think about improving their margins first. They think about that as an afterthought. They don't really want to cut overheads. What they want to do is grow, right? And so they go about it sort of the inverse of what I'm suggesting they ought to do. So there is some formula behind it. I agree with you.
And I think part of what you just said is to attack it all step by step. That there needs to be a focus, one thing at a time. Even what we do with Roofers World, every year there's a focus. A year ago it was the fill rates. We got the fill rates under control. Okay, great. Now let's grow the revenue. Now that we're actually fulfilling the orders that we have, let's try and work on more. And then, as you kind of start solving one problem at a time, first of all, it's less underwhelming, and I think your probability of success is significantly higher than if you were just to attack everything at once. You just wear yourself out because not everything's going to work, right? No turnaround has ever gone 100% according to plan. I think even if you're batting like 60, 70%, that's pretty good.
It's really good. It's really good. And I think that's, the whole premise of Martinis with Scott, winning momentum in business, is about changing the momentum. I had a part of my listening tour at Navani yesterday. I won't drop a name there, but I talked to one of the employees for an hour, just listened to her view as to what's wrong with the company, what could be better with her job, so on and so forth. And I asked about her. She'd been there, I think she said 28 years or some very long number. And so she's been there through the good times, through the trouble, and now for the beginning 2-3 months into the turnaround, asking her how she feels about it. Like, what emotions does she go through as a clerking? Actually, she's worked at every station in that company. This is not just clerking by any stretch of the imagination. Every step of the manufacturing she's worked in over those 20 odd years. How do you feel about that? And I said, people have a hard time putting words to it. I said, but you must have this, when things were really bad, just feeling you wake up every morning and you're losing. Like, you just know you're going to go to work and you're going to lose today. And it's going to be a little bit microfraction worse than it was the day before. And that's bad momentum. And changing momentum for the positive is about doing what you just said, just one little step at a time, just fixing one little thing. And the next day, fixing something else. And don't get overwhelmed by this laundry list of 800 line items of stuff that is wrong and needs to be fixed. Because as soon as you start showing some positive direction, it motivates your team. It changes culture. You can talk positively to your stakeholders, that being your creditors that you haven't paid, your bank, new lenders, new investors, anybody on the outside, you have some positivity and direction. It really doesn't matter if you're making a bunch of money. It doesn't matter if the turnaround's not done. It's the direction that matters to start getting people excited and get them on side.
Being directionally accurate, because the last thing you want is to set your bar too low, whereas you're barely making any changes. It's better to kind of aim high and land somewhere lower than what you expected than to land low and just aim low. That wasn't very eloquent, but you actually did
no, but I've actually did a whole show on that, because I think this is a huge issue, and the bullshit of budgets, particularly when you're trying to affect change. And the basic argument is, say you want your gross margin to move from, or your contribution margin to move from 25%, and you'd like it to be 40%, right? And so, or you want your fill rate, there's a easier one, a fill rate to be, currently is 30%, you want it to be 100%. Well, for sure, someone's going to stand up and they're going to say, that's impossible. We can never meet 100% fill rate. We can never deliver all of our products on time in accordance with our policy. And the answer is, that's what our goal is. Our goal is to be perfect. We're going to do 100%. And then in year one, which you and I have experienced more than once, if you get to 97%, those same people come and say you're a failure, right? They say you're a failure because you didn't reach the 100%. You move from 30 to 97, right? But now you're a failure. Whereas what they would have done is they would have set a budget for this year of 60, and they would have met it, to the year after of 80, and they would have met it potentially. And it's just a slow, painful, deadly way to affect change. You need to, my advice in affecting change in companies like this is set the ideal, aim towards it, and don't punish people for missing it, right? It's not a budget, it's a directionally accurate movement on a particular KPI.
There you go.
There you go. All right. So you personally have become one of Canada's top turnaround professionals.
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
Oh, no, I thought we were going to keep going. I'm going to stay on this topic. Go on.
Okay. And so what advice do you, like, just take your top 3 or 4 pieces of advice for business owners, presidents, people that are trying to fix a troubled business. What have you learned?
First one is that money is not, strangely enough, just throwing money at a problem very seldom actually solves it. I remember.
Oh God, yes.
Yeah. Oh. And I'll give you an example. This has been on Twitter every time that, there's a picture of Jeff Bezos when Amazon first started. He's sitting at this office and it's dark outside, and he's got this banner that's like the equivalent of a kindergarten writing happy birthday on it. It says Amazon.com. And that's his first office. And there's like a bunch of people responding that, Jeff Bezos worked his way up, and et cetera, et cetera. And then there's a bunch of people responding to it that it's a well-known fact that he actually got a $300,000 loan from his parents to start this business. And the perception is that, well, if you give $300,000 to anyone, they'll make magic with it. They'll build an Amazon. And I think in our experience, in like the last 7 years, we've seen cases where people received much more money from various sources, much more money than $300,000, and they didn't end up with an Amazon. Throwing cash at a situation is very seldom the answer, because it usually goes down the same hole as all the previous cash that has been thrown at it. That all the cash that's been generated by this one successful business, whether it's a government loan or a asset-backed loan, like an operating loan, whatever it is.
Yeah.
More cash is not the answer. You need to.
I remember when I was 35-ish, so 20 odd years ago, and I had a lot of debt, a lot, by anyone's standards, even today. And I don't mean personal debt, but corporate debt. Some of it was guaranteed, and it was in the hundreds of millions. And I had a shortfall every month of 400,000 US. And unfortunately, the Canadian dollar was at like 62 cents or 68 cents at the time. So that just kind of made it worse, because I was trying to raise a lot of money in CAD rather than US. But every day I woke up and I knew that I had $400,000 to fill this month. And I had to go raise that in private markets. And the problem was more than $300,000 is kind of my point. I used to wander around slightly depressed and dazed. And at the time there was new lotteries coming out, like the Ontario lottery or this lottery, and everybody was so excited. Like you'd be excited about some Powerball thing today for $100 million. I'm making up numbers. I don't know what they are, but back then I remember clearly it was $7 million. It was $7 million and no one had ever heard about this size of number in a lottery. And I remember wandering around thinking, it's just not going to help. Which was kind of a depressing spot to be in. Anyways, it all worked out great, but you can spend a lot of money really fast. That's the point of the story. And money is always a symptom of your foolishness.
The underlying issue.
Yeah.
The other one is, it's really important and probably very, very difficult to become aware of your bias, of your, and part of that, and that's a very broad statement, whether that's realizing that maybe being a pessimist, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you expect things to fail, you behave as if they've already failed, and therefore you're not really putting in all your effort into things. And I see that all the time, and that's just, again, it comes down to just general management fatigue.
Have you seen that all the time just in the last 2 years that I've been talking out loud about confirmation bias nonstop every day, or were you seeing it before that?
I think I just called it more like a loser attitude.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of written off as kind of like a genetic thing. Like you're either a winner or you're a loser, but then there really is like a winner mentality.
100%, right?
Yeah.
And so for the listeners, confirmation bias is the idea that the facts aren't driving your decisions. Your decision is your emotional decision. And then you seek facts. Your brain seeks patterns and facts that support your decision, ignores patterns and facts that are contrary to your decision, and in fact actively tries to manipulate data to fit what the decision has already been. That's what confirmation bias is, and you see it in American politics. It's, you've just got two separate channels. Watch The Social Dilemma. You got two social on Netflix. You got two social, two streams of consciousness going on. It's like, as Scott Adams would say, two movies on one screen. And if you start thinking about that, it doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter what the facts are, you either ignore it or you manipulate it, you rationalize it to your already point of view. And if you start looking at companies, you're just dead on, right? So if you're an employee in a troubled company and you wake up in the morning and you know that you're losing, your company sucks, that your job is unhappy, that your plant is dirty, and you go to work and there's something you're presented with, how do you interpret that fact? Do you interpret it in a happy, winning, things are going to work out kind of manner? Or do you interpret it in, oh my God, this is just another thing that's going to go bad? I think that's the way I would express it. And it is so powerful. It's so powerful.
And what's interesting is that people who haven't, if they're not successful or they haven't experienced success in a while, it's like they don't understand that just because that successful people don't make mistakes or they don't have failures. Like if you look at any successful business, and you ask them if they were batting 100 every day, I mean, obviously not. They just kept coming up to the plate, just kept showing up. And even if you show up, if you wake up and you're at a failure company and you show up, whether you're running it or if you're an employee, and you're showing up knowing that your team's going to lose, well, yeah, they're going to lose because nobody's actually putting in any effort. And, I think back of in Roofer's world where the sales manager there would like miss sales calls because he'd be like, well, they weren't going to buy from us anyways. Well, how the fuck do you know? Right? If you don't show up to the call, of course they're not going to buy from you. But that's just what's in your head already, that it's not going to work out.
Yep.
I'm not making effort. I'm already a loser. Nobody wants to, have me in their club as a member. Then of course it's not going to work out.
Yeah.
If you just keep going in at 100%, if your bias is that you don't need to hit 100 to be successful. In fact, you just have to hit a little bit more than you did last year, and that is progress. Then that's
well, not even. I would even be more aggressive. Like to me, it's always about just testing. Like it's a form of A/B testing, because here's the dirty little secret for those listening. Nobody really knows the answer as to what's going to work and what's not going to work in business. You try stuff out. That's what you do. And you might try out 50 things and they could all be wrong. And then you finally hit on the one thing that works for that solution. Well, that's a 50 loss, 1 win. But if your 50 losses last an hour or a day or some really short period of time, you tried it out, wasn't working, try something out, wasn't working. That's how it works. That's how it works in business. That's how it works in life. It's not the smartest person sitting around and always being right. It's not about that at all.
No, but if you go back to having that victim mentality, that's all that matters to you.
Yeah. It's not only all that matters, it actually, you seek it. You seek it because it feeds the narrative. It feeds the confirmation bias. The confirmation bias is we're losing and we're not doing well. And what gives you comfort? What gives you comfort is facts that support what you already think. So it becomes, for some people, it becomes a good thing to lose.
And the third one, and I think they're all tied together, is question how your actions are productive. Because very often, more often than not, we act on our emotion rather than what is the right thing to do. And the easiest way to kind of check your bias is to say, how is this productive? You want to be productive. Let's make that decision first, and then assess accordingly. Like we had an IT issue at the Navani. And what did we have happen in our little chat group for, the team? Just one person going off at the IT guy. You're right, he screwed up. But how is it productive? Just keep airing your issue. We know there's a fuck up.
Right. This is a persuasion point.
Yeah.
In a sense, right? Like how, okay, we know what's right and wrong factually. What good is it going to do you in that situation to be pissed off and scream and yell? Whereas maybe there's a different way to get what you need from this counterparty.
Other than proving to the world that you're emotionally unstable, and frankly, what kind of leader are you if that's your response? Nobody's looking for the craziest person in chaos. They're not looking to that person for guidance.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say in that particular situation, they were right, but I think the reaction was wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And not wrong in the sense that he should have been pissed off. He should have been angry. His points were not wrong, but what good was he doing? Which is really what you're saying.
I mean, yeah, like he's not wrong, but how is it productive just to go off?
Yeah.
If anything, you're impairing their ability to do a better job and fix it. Because now you've just gotten them emotionally riled up. And ultimately,
well, the person left. At the end of the day, this guy left. The recipient of that. Right?
And is the situation any better because of it? Was it productive?
No, you're 100% right on this point. You're 100% right. So as a business leader trying to affect change, let's just assume that you're right. Yeah. It's not even a debate about whether you're right or wrong. Let's just assume that you're right. How are you going to handle this situation to affect change?
Because primitive chest beating has never gotten anyone anywhere outside of the actual jungle.
Gotcha. I think those are excellent points.
Thanks.
You're welcome. I can't believe you didn't say the word model once.
I did. In the previous time when I talked about all the models we've built on this show in previous episodes.
Financial models, for those wondering. Okay. Entrepreneurship and high growth. We've done a lot of that work as well. You're moving on to an entrepreneurial venture.
Yep.
What would be your top 2 or 3 pieces of advice based on the last 7 years of working in that, advising in that space?
I think, and I say this on the previous episode as well, is that our advice is not only good for turnarounds, our advice is excellent for in creating protocols before there is a problem. And in fact,
it's the exact same thing.
It's exactly the same.
Yeah.
You just assume you're already in the hole and behave accordingly. And that ties into your diligent reporting, your cost controls, your cash flow and model building, everything about it, and creating protocols to follow even when to troubleshoot. Anything in high growth or high decline are very, very similar situations from a management standpoint. So everything we just talked about is exactly.
The challenges are the same.
Yeah, the challenges are the same. Money does not fix everything. Check your bias, check your confirmation bias. Be humble, take responsibility, because responsibility ultimately means that you can impact change. If you say if I'm not responsible for it, all you're actually saying is that this is outside of my control.
Right. All right. What else on entrepreneurship? Anything?
I think culture is very important. It's something that I kind of wish you'd talk about more on your channel. I know you did the Navani employee address, which is great. But I think it's that specific element is much more art than science. That's probably the most artsy side of the turnaround. And we talked about this a few times.
What would you say about culture?
I think it's really hard. If there's one element to someone treating it as a job, especially whether it's like a high growth job or a turnaround, but you have to instill the notion of purpose, because purpose is ultimately what drives employees. And that's exactly what I think is the greatest challenge in a turnaround. Purpose, when you haven't had it.
Can you give an example?
Well, for example, this woman, and I know who you're talking about, who's been at Navani for 28 years. And she's worked every job, but you ask her what her purpose is, and it's just she clocks out at 5 o'clock. And there's really no, and I think from that perspective, what I've seen at the company, it's very much like complaints, no solutions, because there is no purpose. If people have enough purpose, they're motivated to find solutions for themselves rather than come to you with problems, which really means you have several turnaround agents.
I see Navani in particular as different than that. I think that and I think this is small town Canada culture that does this.
Coldwater, Ontario, population 1,100. I think it's where Red Green was actually filmed. Do you remember that CBC show?
Really? I did not know that.
Yeah, it's because the whole point is he lives like 69 beer stores north of Toronto.
Right.
Possum Lodge.
Yeah, it's not that. So he's like in Richmond Hill.
No.
Concord, yeah. So I think that just the culture from that area, I'm not going to say it's work yourself to death, but I think there's good values. They care about their family and their teammate and their company. I get a lot of that from Navani, maybe more so than any company has ever dealt with, to be honest with you. There's a lot of pitching in. There's a lot of, we're here for each other. And I love that. And if I compare that to one of our clients in the food business in Toronto recently, and what a fantastic turnaround. I actually went golfing with him a couple of weeks ago, and it's just outstanding what's happened there. What a great success. But that had a workforce that was, not really from the same culture and not dedicated to the purpose of that particular company and to each other. Most importantly, I think it's the to each other part, right? They're just keeping their head down and doing their job and punching their ticket 100%.
Yeah.
Right. And Navani, to be honest with you, I don't see that. I don't see that at all. I think it's exactly the opposite. So to come back to this idea of culture, to me, if we pick on Navani, and if you're listening to the show, we can go back to Navani Stainless. There's been probably 8 episodes on the turnaround journey of the Navani Stainless, and after we bought it, and there will be more, so you can catch up on yourself for yourself that way. I think we haven't had to deal with the purpose of looking out for the company and looking out for each other, but we have had to deal with the culture of losing versus winning and trying to turn it from one to the other. And that's how I look at culture. To me, that's what winning momentum is. It's about changing the culture internally and externally and communicating a sense of pride. Um, I mean, what is the first big thing that I've tried to deal with at Navani was to hire sanitation, to hire a cleaner, right? Right. That's not to make more money, right? That's pride in your workspace and the fact that the toilets haven't been cleaned in a year. And, it's just made a huge impact on how people feel about their job. So maybe I don't express it in terms of culture, but that's kind of what goes through my brain. I think those are the cultural things at Navani. So is that a hit with what you were saying?
I guess in a different regard, but that's exactly my point. Like culture is such a vast definition, right?
Well, that's why I ask you what you mean, because I think it's easy for people to walk around and say, oh, you need a good culture. Like, what the hell does that mean? Like, exactly what does that mean?
Okay,
To me,
so,
I boil it down to two things. I don't want too many assholes working for me, number one. And I want positivity. And I want hustle.
what does positivity mean?
Positivity
in
means
difficult times. Does that mean that your leadership freaks out when there's an IT problem?
precisely. It's exactly the issue, right? There's always going to be problems. Look at you and I and anybody in the insolvency turnaround world, to be blunt about it, are completely numb to stress and to daily problems. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, completely.
Like our threshold for dealing with shit is way above normal people.
Oh yeah.
And mine is way above yours because I'm older, right? And I'm doing this longer. Do you agree with that?
Oh yeah.
I was laughing with Cohen the other day, and he was saying something to that effect. But he says, "I don't know what's wrong with me, to be honest with you, because none of this just bothers me." And it's like, it's not you; it's people in this job. I mean, every single day we wake up and we deal with just
Enormous amounts of shit. Yeah.
But life-changing shit, not just nuisance shit, like life-changing shit, either in our lives or other people's lives. And so you become numb, both through practice and also through being more educated as to what you can get away with and what you can't get away with.
Do you think there's a function where people get upset about things because they think they're special and it shouldn't be happening to them? Whereas we have absolutely no regard for, I'm special and it shouldn't be happening to me. It's like, well, of course it has. It's going to happen to me. It's happened to me, over the last 7 years, almost every day.
Right. I think that people,
well, not just humility, in fact.
I think there's chaos and order in all aspects of life, including in a business. And in business, if you have too much chaos, you're a troubled business. Like, things are just on fire all the time. And if you have too much order, you're a stagnant business and you're going to die. And you need to be somewhere in the middle with some creativity, but some systems and some order. And I think that that's an organization, but I think that people's personality is the same. There's chaos and there's order. And if you're an orderly, I like to run things and they need to be this way, and I freak out if they're not that way. If you're an orderly personality type in a chaotic organization, that's not a great fit, right? You need to adapt your ways to work with this. And what I look for when I say positivity is people who can look at a bunch of problems that came up today that are new and can focus on the positive things to affect change, right? Because if you spend all day putting out fires and dealing with the negative things, you're never going to turn around. You're never going to affect change.
Great. Good point.
Right? If you go in, I used to say this at the food company, the turnaround that we did, that was so successful. We started they had stopped doing meetings, operational meetings. And so this was a plant making food products, and every day was a new batch. And so every day something new could be wrong. They were going to make their attainment for the day or what have you. And
every
they stopped
batch resulted in a new bitch. I know. They would just have a bitch session.
Well, they had a laundry list of stuff, so much so that they stopped having morning meetings. All right. And so one of the biggest things we did was they started again a morning meeting, a production meeting. And what I did was there's probably 20 people in that room, supervisors and management, not laborers. I mean, there's 200 people on the floor, but probably 20 people in that room. And what I said was, the meeting is 15 minutes, no longer. It's stand up. Like, I don't want you sitting down, getting comfortable. And I don't want to hear one negative thing about what went wrong yesterday. Not one. I don't want to hear it, right? There's going to be serious consequences. What I want to hear about is, what are we doing today, and what do you need from your teammate to make it work, right? And what I kept trying to impress on senior management is, I've never been an NHL hockey coach, but I know the sport pretty well. I have a hard time believing a coach walks into the dressing room an hour before game time and says, here's what you screwed up last game, right? That's not going to happen, right? They're going to talk about what you need to do today in this game to win, right? You gotta cover your defense. You gotta clear the net. You gotta do whatever it is that you're trying to focus on today. You have a conversation about that. You don't have a conversation about how much you screwed up last game. And that's what I mean by positivity.
But that also goes hand in hand with prioritizing. We've said focus a lot, but we haven't said priorities. And that's exactly it. These meetings go on and actually accomplish nothing because no one has any priorities. And it comes back to, how can we be productive?
Yes.
Prioritize, and then you kept answering that question for every priority, every item that's deemed a priority on your list.
Yeah, I agree with
Only
that.
without emotions and without bias, without confirmation bias.
We're down to 3 minutes here.
It's the flask.
I'll show you the flask.
May you never go to hell, but always be on your way.
This was a present from you to me way back when. I don't recall why or when, but I have it right here in the new home.
Awesome. It's where it belongs, in that kind of setting.
Thank you for that. What else are we going to cover? Anything?
That's it. Unless you have other topics.
I'm just trying to keep you talking for another 1 minute, and then you're like, you're done. You're out of Sinclair Range.
Get out. Removed.
Removed.
Yeah, I think that people have a lot to learn from you, personally and professionally. But I think your brand that I know you're building very effectively, by the way, is that boils down to that winners never quit and quitters never win. And whatever it takes to make that formula happen is what you have to do. And sure, there's little subcategories to it, but there's not a whole lot. The whole point is not to overwhelm yourself with to-do lists.
I just, before I got on with you, I had a call with a lawyer in Toronto I haven't talked to in a long time. And he was asking about stuff that I'm doing, and I was complaining about something I'm in the middle of. I'm just like, I so wish I wasn't in this. There's every turnaround and every file I've ever been in, there's been a really strong emotion at some point to quit. Like there's like a really, not a small emotion, like a really strong emotion.
Get me out of here.
Just get me out of here. 100% of the time. And I think that every business owner struggling has that feeling, and focus on the positive. You need to fight through it.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the 7 years.
Thank you.
You know, as everything ever goes sideways, I'll sure find you on Twitter again.
There you go. Just like the first time.
I found Olga on. Do you want to tell that story as a parting?
Sure. It was June 27th, 2012. And my best friend was getting married the next day. And I was on the GO train and I was really stressed out. And my go-to move was to do the puzzle in the back of the metro, back when you could like take your mask off and like do stuff on the train and not be 6 feet apart from other people, and you could actually interact. Those were the days. But I didn't have a pen that day, and I was really losing my mind. Like I only had like 3 hours of sleep for months at a time, every night, but it was just a mess. So I really needed to do this crossword puzzle, and I didn't have a pen. And there's this one guy who's like super nerdy dude, just across not even across the aisle, but he's like he's just in the seat in front of me. And he's got this backpack. And I was like, just ask him, sorry, do you have a pen? And he goes, nope, don't have a pen. He goes back to his BlackBerry and starts like tweeting about this crazy nut.
John, you're a dick, by the way.
You are. And I was like, I just really need this pen. you didn't check your backpack. Like, you have a backpack in front of you. Do you mind just checking your backpack for a writing utensil? And he looks up at me, he's like, listen, you don't have a pen, right? That's true. How is it like not, how can you not imagine that there's other people on this train who also don't have a pen? I was like, listen, I just need a pen, just check your bag. And it kind of escalated from there. And at the end, it just said, like, what's your deal? I said, I work this really stressful job. I'm really sorry. My best friend's getting married. I'm the maid of honor. I haven't done anything for this wedding. I just really need a pen. And he goes, well, maybe you should like leave your job. I got a guy for you to meet. And that was Scott Sinclair. And strangely enough, they had only met on Twitter the week prior. That's how you hire people, friends.
That's exactly how I hire people. So if you want a job, hit me up on Twitter.
There you go. Or in the YouTube comments, maybe you can use a different platform. Expand.
The last YouTube comment was some nice fellow who suggested it would be much better for him if we did the show in Hindi.
Oh, we'll see. There's
so
options now.
I told him I'd try.
Okay, there you go.
There you go. All right, Olga, thank you for everything.
Thank you.
I'm sure we'll see you on the show again.
Absolutely.
All right, take care.